So the Quran, brothers and sisters, reminds us, in multiple places, I've just listed three examples here, that we should be eating not only what's halal, but also what is tayyib. In Muslim circles, we always have these big debates and issues surrounding zabiha versus non-zabiha, hand cut versus, hand slaughter and machine slaughter and so forth. But and I'm not going to be spending too much time on that, but I want to talk more about the fact that Allah reminds us to eat not only what is halal, but also what is tayyib. So, for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, يا أيها الذين آمنوا كلوا من طيبات ما رزقناكم واشكروا لله. O you who believe, eat from the pure provisions or the tayyibat we have given you and be grateful to Allah. Similarly, the second verse I've listed on the slide too also mentions eating what is both halal and tayyib. And again, Allah reminds us to be grateful for the favors of Allah. So again, here Allah is pointing out that what I said earlier, which is that not only is it important to eat what is halal and tayyib, but these are amongst the greatest of the blessings of Allah. And therefore, He ties it to gratitude here again. So what does tayyib itself mean? We already know that halal relates to what's lawful as opposed to what's unlawful, but tayyib relates to what is good, what is pure, what is clean, what is wholesome, what is fair, what is lawful. So again, it's one of those very rich Arabic words, like so many others, that a single word in English simply doesn't do it justice. But it has connotations of all of these meanings relating to what's good, pure, clean, and more. So what is not tayyib? We're going to get into that in a little more detail, but just to give you a few quick examples, certain synthetic foods, synthetic chemicals, synthetic additives. We'll have a quick discussion on genetically modified foods. A lot of times when I give this presentation or talk to patients ask if organic and tayyib are the same thing. They're very similar, but they're not technically equivalent. So for example, organic foods relate to the fact that by definition, in the production process, they're not allowed to use any synthetic chemicals. They're not allowed to use genetically modified ingredients. As it pertains to animals, the rules that relate to organic also relate to the fact that animals need to be allowed to graze and be in their natural settings. So in that sense, there's a lot that's common or similar with what's tayyib, but technically they're not equivalent because you could theoretically have organic pork, you could have organic alcohol or wine, and obviously those things are not halal to begin with. So in that sense, there's a slight difference. But again, I want to highlight also quickly this next hadith, and I've only listed part of it, but this will give our brothers and sisters and viewers a small glimpse of how important this really is to consume what is tayyib. So there's a hadith in Sahih Muslim where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us, "Inna Allah tayyib, la yuqbalu illa tayyiba." Oh people, Allah Himself is tayyib, and He only accepts what is tayyib. The Prophet ﷺ in this long hadith then goes on to mention two Quranic verses, including the one I mentioned earlier from Surah Baqarah that relates to eating what is tayyib. So he mentions these two verses, and then he gives us an example. The Prophet ﷺ tells us about a man who is traveling in the desert. He's traveled wide and far to the point where he's very dusty and disheveled. And then he starts making dua. He raises his hands in the air to the sky and says, Ya Rab, Ya Rab, right? But the Prophet ﷺ tells us that his food is not lawful. His drink is not lawful. His clothing is not lawful. His nourishment or sustenance is not lawful. So then he says, how can this person's dua be accepted? SubhanAllah, may Allah protect us from this state. But the reason, again, I highlighted that is the fact that a lot of times Muslims don't necessarily take their food or their diet or certain aspects of their physical health seriously. But the reality is, in this particular example, if we're not making a concerted effort to try to eat what is not only halal, but also is tayyib, then subhanAllah, and may Allah protect us from that, even our dua may not be accepted. So it's just a simple example. So to give you a few examples of things that are not tayyib, to give you overall perspective, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, says we're exposed to around 86,000 chemicals in our food and in our environment overall. That's a staggering number if you really think about it. It's really mind boggling that we're exposed to that many thousands of chemicals. Within the food supply itself, there's around 2,000 chemicals, if that wasn't enough for you. But out of all of those, I've just identified like a dozen or so that we should be at least mindful of. And I don't have time to go through all of these, but I'll just quickly say that in the food supply, when we look at ingredients, we should be mindful of avoiding or trying to avoid what is includes artificial sweeteners, artificial colorings. And again, I'm not talking about what's halal here. Again, just to clarify what I was saying earlier, there's a difference between what's halal and what's tayyib. So I'm not making any fatwas here. Um, High fructose corn syrup I listed on here because there's so many studies that it can be even worse than white sugar in the sense that it significantly increases risk for diabetes, as well as heart disease, as well as obesity, even more so than white sugar. Roundup, some of our viewers may have heard about, is a very harmful weed killer or pesticide or herbicide that was made by Monsanto many decades ago. There are class action lawsuits against them because they sell that to farmers who in turn spray that on soy fields, corn fields, wheat fields, and it's getting into finished food products. And unfortunately, it's a known carcinogen. It's an endocrine disruptor. So again, something to be aware of. The next two are fat preservatives. You should look for on labels. Trans fats are associated with more with like deep fried or highly processed oils. Titanium dioxide and sodium benzoate are two food preservatives that have certain negatives. Petrolatum, the only reason I listed it there in and of itself is not inherently harmful, but there's something called PAHs that are associated with petroleum derived compounds that sometimes it can get contaminated with and can be a carcinogen. Those last three, polyethylene glycol, phthalates, parabens, are associated more with lotions and skin products, and again are things that we should be trying to avoid. To give you further examples, because a lot of times when I talk to patients or people I know, they're a little bit confused about what is really tayyib, what is not tayyib. And again, there's not necessarily a fine line, but just to give you a simple example, when you think about meat, I brought up meat earlier. If you think about a chicken and you go to a farm and you slaughter it and you follow all the Zabiha guidelines you know of, but then you later find out that this chicken was fed growth hormone, the chicken was fed antibiotics. You find that it was raised in a cage for much of its life. You find that it was given a protein feed that chickens normally don't eat just to make it bigger and more plump. Then you could make the case that it's halal, but it's not necessarily tayyib. So this is just a simple example to give you a little bit of an idea. I gave you a few further examples. Some things like bologna, hot dogs, bacon. Again, I'm not making any fatwas. Still halal. But if you want to be at your optimum health, optimum diet, then we have to be a little bit more mindful about these things because those products have quite harmful preservatives, including sulfites and sulfates. That's why preserved meats last so long. So again, we should be aware of that. And as it relates to grains, being much more careful with highly processed or refined white flour, white sugar products, white pasta, and all the good stuff that comes with, whether it's commercial cakes, cookies, pies, candy, and the like. So again, we should be sticking more to the whole grain organic options as much as we can, inshallah. Same with dairy. I already mentioned chickens. It pertains to eggs too, it pertains to dairy. So many sources of dairy in this country and around the world are unfortunately laden with growth hormones of various types. Animals are fed antibiotics to avoid the herd from getting certain infections. So again, ideally, we should be consuming more organic products here. And as it relates to dairy, you could even make a case for consuming raw. We could get into that in the question and answer if you'd like. Same with respect to oils. Doctors many years ago used to tell people to avoid, butter and ghee and olive oil and so forth. And use more margarine shortening. But as you probably know, that thinking has changed significantly in the last several years, and they realize that those are actually causing more harm than good. Similarly, with certain hydrogenated seed oils, again, these are not getting into what's halal and haram, but just what's better and what's preferred. But corn oil, soy oil, sunflower oil are examples of oils that are very high in something called omega 6. So to give you a quick background, the body and fats are made up of omega 3, omega 6, omega 7, omega 9. But when you get too much omega 6, which these oils are high in, they literally increase what's called systemic inflammation. And most commercial products, most restaurants are using, the cheapest oils. They're not going to be using gourmet oil. And so most people are getting overloaded with omega 6, and that's why it's good to minimize those. A few other examples: avoiding certain types of chips. I used to actually work at Frito-Lay as an engineer, so I saw up close and first some of their products, including Cheetos, Fritos, Doritos, and more. And to be fair, all of their chips I wouldn't consider non-tayyib, but especially the ones that have very strong seasonings and the additives that go into these seasonings, like the color, that orange color that everybody sees on Cheetos and everybody sees on their little kids' fingers. When you see that it doesn't come off like a week later, or the seasoning you see on Doritos and so forth, those have certain harmful ingredients. Similarly with drinks, there's so many hundreds of drinks out there. Ideally, we should be sticking more with the natural products like water and homemade smoothies or juicing, like with vegetables, fruits. I gave a couple other examples of like green tea, coconut water, but pretty much all of the commercial sodas, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and so forth, energy drinks like Monster, Celsius, the sweet drinks that typically have high fructose corn syrup, artificial coloring, and more, are all things we should be more mindful of, inshallah.